Hello everyone, I am so excited for today's Biz Chats. It's not even funny. It's sponsored by Touch Bistro, in which our guest today states it is the best restaurant POS system on the planet. With that said, our guest today is Bruce Croxon. He's a co-founder of Lavalife, building them from a 400 to 600 employee count and achieving revenue just under 100 million. He sold that company for 180 million, which is great. Since that time, he's been active as both an investor and an advisor for early stage companies in tech and hospitality. He's also a former Dragon on Dragon's Den and currently leading Round13, a company dedicated to investment in growth stage digital Canadian companies. He's also the co-host on the Disruptors, a weekly show spotlighting Canadian businesses. You can find that on BNN and CTV. And what I personally love about Bruce is he's very vocal about believing that Canadian entrepreneurs can really hold their own in the world, which I definitely appreciate. It's fair to say that he knows a thing or two about small businesses and entrepreneurship. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect with him right now and have a nice chat with him.
I'm here.
Bruce,
how are you? I'm good. Thanks for having me.
No, it's great. As a Canadian entrepreneur, I personally want to say it's great to have you on our end.
You know what? Let me get settled here. Couldn't be happier to be here, and thanks for the great introduction. I was well said. I have been in the startup ecosystem a long time.
Absolutely. So your insight's going to be on point.
Oh, let's hope so.
All right. So I appreciate your time. So I'm going to get right into it. Do you see value in buying existing businesses or franchises?
I mean, the short answer to that is absolutely, because it comes from, my experience. Starting a business is one of the hardest and riskiest things that you can choose to do, right? So the data doesn't lie. As enthusiastic as I am about startups and getting things going from scratch, the data will tell you that most businesses fail rather than succeed, no matter the best efforts involved, what have you. So anytime you've got an existing business, you've arguably been past one of the most difficult stages of business formation, and that's the startup phase. So on so many levels, it makes a lot of sense, yes.
Okay, perfect. Now, my next question is, what are ways to grow existing businesses? So a lot of people think that if they buy an existing established business, the potential growth is gone. Do you think that's true?
No, I think 99% of businesses have one thing in common. They all need distribution. Whether it's somebody coming to you or you taking your product out to somebody else, every business needs distribution. And I haven't found too many businesses that can't be broken down simply by saying, look, how much does it cost you to get a customer into your store or get a customer onto your platform versus what that customer is ultimately going to be worth to you. And if you can create a situation where you're paying to drive traffic or you're paying to attract a customer, and that number is significantly less than what that customer can be worth to you, you've got the makings of a growth business. So I don't think that exercise ever stops. I mean, there's not too many, there are industries that mature and the growth does flatten and competition increases. But as long as you're in a situation where you can attract net new customers and you don't have to pay too much for them, there's no reason the growth should ever have to stop on a small business.
So at that point, it's all about scalability.
It is. And I think, one of the things we consider as investors is, how big a market are you playing in? If you're playing in a market that with products and services that everybody needs, for example, accounting, bookkeeping services, or in the case of Touch Bistro, restaurant POS, people have to eat, right? And not everybody's eating at home, right? So, new restaurants are opening up all the time. one of the things that attracted us as investors to Touch Bistro, by the way, thanks Touch Bistro for putting this on today, was that the market for that product is massive. So as long as they execute and they can continue to attract new restaurants to their platform at a number less than what those restaurants are worth to them, their business will continue to grow.
Perfect. Now, what are some ways entrepreneurs can increase the value of a business? I know it's a broad question, but is there maybe a 1, 2, 3?
Well, I mean, when you look at valuation, a couple things come into play. One is, as I've already mentioned, the size of the market. So if you have a chunk of a market, but there's clearly more to come, and you've identified a way to capture that market share that you can convince the people that are valuing you that you've got a good shot at going to get, that goes directly to value. I mean, on the flip side of that, when you've attracted a customer and you've provided a service to that customer and they're happy, and they have shown a propensity to come back and use you time and time again, or in the case of software, they're not using you, churning you out as a supplier, those are good indicators of value. So it's really a combination of how good a job you've done at attracting and retaining customers, and how much further you can convince the market, whether that market's a private investor like me or a public stock, whether you can convince them that growth has got a good chance of continuing. And in fact, if you kept getting better, the market is potentially huge.
Got it. Quick question, because I'm getting feedback. Am I on speaker?
You are on my speaker, yeah.
Okay, so I don't think you need that on.
You know what? If I don't have it on, I'm not speaking into the. There's no other mic other than the one that's on my mobile phone.
But are you on Instagram live?
Yes, I am.
So try to see what happens if you take off the speaker.
All right.
Now talk.
How's that?
Now talk.
Is that any better?
That's better.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So the next question is, if a startup isn't VC worthy, is it still sellable?
Oh, absolutely. Venture by its nature is looking for outsized returns. If you look at most venture investments, I mean, a number of them will fail. Now that is in the process of changing because the software is becoming a lot more predictable in the businesses that we get involved in. But venture by its nature is looking for things that are not going to, opportunities that are going to knock it out of the park. And when you're dealing in that level of risk, you are going to have failures. So there are a number of steady state businesses that aren't necessarily going to go to the moon, but nonetheless have shown a steady, predictable history of making profit that trade every day. They just might not trade at the same high multiples of some venture companies where there's a chance that they're going to go exponential.
Got it. Because from a VC perspective, you're making 10 deals. You're hoping that the one deal is paying off all the rest.
Well, that's the traditional definition of venture, yeah. And
exactly.
You are hoping for some home runs, but there's businesses that trade every day, at 4 to 6 to 8 times, profit that would not qualify as venture investments that, are definitely saleable.
Got it. Now, in your opinion, what makes a business sellable? Like, I know there's multiple reasons, but what do you think takes the lead?
Well, I think in the non-venture world, it's predictability. If you've got a history of profit that has been able to survive economic cycles, you've got a history of customers that are continuing to support your platform. you can point to a steady history of that doesn't involve a lot of volatility. I think you've got a certain class of investor that appeals to very, very strongly. When you're into venture or more speculative types of investments, things like the quality of the team that you're backing is always important. How competitive the market is that you're competing with out there, and like I said off the top, how big a market are you playing in? Like if you're dealing in restaurants, that's a huge market. Everyone has to eat, so that would encourage a stronger valuation than if you were designing dog carriages, right, where the market could be a lot more limited.
Makes sense. Perfect. So we are midway. Have about 5 more questions.
Sure.
But I did want to remind everyone that this segment is sponsored by Touch Bistro. And if you're a restaurant owner, you should definitely check them out. touchbistro.com. So the next question is, as an existing business owner, is buying a business a good growth strategy?
I think it is, and I'll tell you why. Growth has to come from somewhere, right? I've got a kind of an old adage which basically says, you're either growing or you die. And you can either manufacture growth, which, if you know what you're doing, is obviously a viable alternative, but it does take a while. But there's absolutely no reason that if you see an opportunity to bolt something onto your business, again, gets you past that all difficult startup phase if somebody's already done it. And, one of the cautions on buying businesses is it's not an automatic that it will do as well under you as it did under the previous buyer. So I would encourage people to think about, what is it, how are they going to fit? Are the cultures, is there enough similarity in the cultures, right, to be able to mesh these two things together? Because there's been a lot of good ideas that have been destroyed by people not being able to get along or that have different outlooks on things. So, you have to take that into account. But as a general rule, if you can acquire somebody, it's a great way to grow your business.
Perfect. Now, in your opinion, what are some creative ways to finance an acquisition?
Question one more time.
No problem. What are some good ways to finance an acquisition?
Well, again, if a company has a history of cash flow, predictable cash flow, I'm always a big fan of using other people's money to leverage that. So particularly, now I know I just saw interest rates just went up today a little bit, but by and large, if you look at this period of time in business compared to other times that I can point to in my career, interest rates are at a historically low level. So money's cheap. Yeah. So if you can go to a Big Five chartered bank or a credit union or an alternative lender and say, look, I'm interested in buying this business. I'm interested in growing my business. Here's my history of cash flow, because they're not in the business of debt financing companies that don't have a history of earnings. Unfortunately, they're very risk averse. But if you do have a history of earnings, you can put debt against that. And I think that that's, an excellent way, as long as you can get comfortable in servicing that debt. Heaven forbid you end up in a situation where you can't, so you have to be careful. But banks are conservative by nature, so they're not generally lending you the money unless they think you can pay it back. So it's a great way to leverage other people's capital to grow.
Makes sense. Now from a branding and social following perspective, what premium do you put on that as far as evaluation of a business?
I think branding's very important. When I think back to my Lavalife days, we owned the online dating space for a number of years there. and we swung way above our weight. Everybody knew the brand in Canada, Australia, and many of the large markets in the US. You know, that didn't come cheaply. Like, we did invest in that brand. It was a consistent brand. It was a brand that was designed to make women in particular feel safe and secure online when they're dating and getting messages from anonymous people. So we put a lot of effort into that, but I give that tremendous credit to us being able to compete with companies that had a lot more money than we did, but people came to trust the brand. So if you can stay consistent and do that right, which is a lot tougher than it sounds, I think brand can count for an incredible amount of value.
Yeah, I agree. I like to tell people nowadays, my opinion, marketing and branding is a significant competitive advantage.
You know, it totally is. And, you know, I deal in the technology sector every day. And when I started in tech, the tech itself being expensive and complicated acted as a barrier to entry and was a source of value in and of itself.
Exactly.
That's no longer the case. You know, I mean, if you gave me a couple of smart programmers and 1/50th the amount of capital that I needed back in the Lavalite days, I could duplicate that system. So it's not about the tech anymore. So what does that leave? It leaves you with sales, marketing, and brand. So arguably even more important today than it ever has been.
Perfect. Next question here. Do you think there's a difference between a business owner and an entrepreneur?
Wow, that's a good question. I read a blog yesterday about, just coincidentally, about, you know, the makeups of entrepreneurs. And, you know, my first answer, my gut reaction to the question is, you know, no, there really isn't. Because if you own a business, you get up every day thinking about that business and, you know, taking risk and hopefully calculated risk. And, you know, if the business doesn't do well, presumably you don't do well either. You're not relying on anybody else to cut you a check. To me, that's the essence of entrepreneurship, right? And risk is a big part of it. So you own a business, you are in the risk game 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, even more so than at any other time since I've been in business, because competition is fiercer. Their ideas are more openly shared. There's no secrets. As we talked earlier, the technology doesn't give you space to grow. It is not a barrier. So I would say being a business owner is as entrepreneurial or more so than ever before, and I think the lines between the two are very blurry.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the one thing they share in common is survival. Right? That's the goal.
You got to get up. Listen, you know, it's so funny. When I was growing up, you know, the cool thing to be was, you know, maybe aspire to be in a rock band, you know, a professional athlete. And, you know, today I think a lot of people aspire to do their own gig. Now, whether that's because jobs have become harder to find, or, you know, university degrees don't necessarily lead you to, you know, the promised land anymore. I don't know, but it seems to be quite trendy. And, you know, it's not as easy as it looks. So I have developed a tremendous respect for anybody that starts their own thing, ends up owning a business, and can, you know, put food on the table off the back of the sweat off their own back. Because, you know, from the outside in, it looks glamorous, but, you know, if you ever add up all the hours that go into getting to that stage and try and justify it on an hourly basis, you'd probably cry, right? So tremendous respect, you know, for anybody that's taken that path.
I appreciate that, and I think everyone listening in appreciates that. But the last question, it'll be kind of fun. One surprising fact about Dragon's Den.
Oh man, surprising fact. Well, you know, it is a heavily edited show, right? So, you know, how that show works is there's 20 days of filming. and each pitch lasts about 40 minutes and it gets edited down to 7 minutes that you see on TV. So I don't know if everybody realizes, you know, the number of, and I should say that it's in CBC's interest to make us look like the smartest business people in Canada. I can assure you and anyone else that's listening today that we make the same number of mistakes with our questions that anybody would if they're seeing a business for the first time. So some of the comments that get left on the editing room floor are hilarious and would do great damage to the brand of the Dragons being the smartest business people in Canada. So I'm not sure everybody realizes how that show exactly goes, but it's in CBC's extreme interest to make us look a lot smarter than we actually are. We make all kinds of mistakes as well.
Well, I appreciate the transparency.
Yep.
So the way I end every biz chat is with a rapid fire. First thing that comes to your mind.
Okay.
What's the last song you listened to?
Yeah, Coldplay.
What's the last movie you watched?
I rewatched what the heck? 7 and Up, the British documentary series.
Nice. And what was the last book you read?
Sapiens.
Perfect. That was quick. Actually, the quickest out of all the people I've interviewed so far.
Wow. You'd almost think you prepped me, which you didn't. Thanks a lot.
I appreciate you. I appreciate having you on this. Once again, thanks to Touch Bistro. Go check them out, touchbistro.com. This has been recorded. I'll put it on YouTube so everyone can watch it. And we'll be back next week with another expert guest. And my little plug, if anyone's interested in buying or selling a business, check out mybusiness.com.
Yeah, you know, before we sign off, let me just tip my hat to you. This is quite an innovative way to use Instagram. And, you know, one of the first out of the gate doing it this way. So hats off to you as well.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for having us.
Have a good day.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.